Rock and roll has always been a young man or woman's game. From day one, it was about exuberance, rebellion, excitement. These things are hard to maintain as one gets older, has been doing it for years, maybe becomes wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. Let's face it, it's hard to be a boundary-pushing rebel when you're old, fat, and cozy, which explains why so many rock and roll acts started out with a flash of brilliance and then hobbled along year after year, running on fumes, eventually to die with a whimper. I think the classic case of this would have to be Elvis. Compare young Elvis to what he became in his final days, overweight, drugged up, camped out in Vegas. But having said that, I believe we shouldn't judge these people too harshly. Rock and roll is what they do and what they've always done. It's not reasonable to expect these folks to quit and become accountants at age 40 just because we notice that they've lost a step or two over the years. So the purpose of this video then is simply to acknowledge and appreciate what, in my opinion, are a few rare acts that manage to achieve the impossible, which is an essentially spotless career, in spite of all the temptations that they must have felt, and in many cases probably still feel, to drag it out long past its prime. Two of us riding nowhere, spending someone's hard-earned pay. You and me Sunday driving, not arriving on our way back home. We're on our way home. We're on our way home. We're going home. That, of course, two of us from the final Beatles album, Let It Be, John and Paul doing their best imitation of the Everly Brothers. Always fun to sing the Beatle harmony. And honestly, if I try to use actual Beatles music in these videos, they generally ding me for copyright. So necessity is the mother of invention here. I fully expect some people will come into the comments, and by the way, please do come into the comments whether you agree with me or not, saying that Let It Be is in fact an inferior Beatles album, and so they really didn't go out on top. Well, I've got two things to say about that. Number one, any album that contains undisputed classics like Let It Be, Across the Universe, The Long and Winding Road, and I would say the song we just heard is not a disappointing album. I think any band would be happy to go out that way. Second, and this has come up on my channel before, even if we concede that Let It Be is not a strong album, which I certainly don't, it's actually not the last Beatles album. Abbey Road was recorded after, but came out before. It's a long story that we won't go into. But few honest music critics could claim that if Abbey Road was your last musical statement, you didn't go out on top of your game. In my opinion, the Beatles had the most perfect career of any rock band. I mean, come on, you had Beatlemania, which has probably never quite been equaled in the music world. But even more impressive to me is the way they managed to negotiate the transition from teen idols to serious musicians. Now, I think their early music was serious music too, but within a few years, you had musicologists writing detailed analyses of their music and how great it was. They seemed to have this almost magical ability to have their fingers on the pulse of what was going on in music and what would be coming next. They were obviously influenced by certain things, but at the same time, they really gave the impression that they were leading all the way. There was a great quote from Lennon at one point. He said, "We always knew that it would end when we wanted it to end, not when the BBC decides to cancel your series," which I thought was great. I love the cockiness of that, classic Lennon. Think of artists like David Cassidy. He was a huge pop idol when the Partridge Family was airing, but struggled to have a career after that. Once the show went away, that was it. The Beatles never fell into that trap. In a way, it's a bit maddening to think about what might have been, since the Beatles were really at the height of their powers when they quit. I sometimes think about what follow-up albums to Let It Be might have looked like. Think of an album that contained Paul's Maybe I'm Amazed with John's Jealous Guy, George's All Things Must Pass. Those records would have stood right up there with the Beatles' best. But I kind of like the way they ended in 1970. There's something about that clean cut at the end of the decade that just feels right. And finally, by the time 1970 rolled around, popular music was changing big time. Led Zeppelin had taken the world by storm. Deep Purple, Black Sabbath was coming in. And I honestly think the Beatles realized that they would never be able to compete with that kind of jammy, hard rock music, nor would they have wanted to try and compete with that. It just wasn't their thing. It wasn't where their hearts were. So, in spite of the fact that they could have gone on to make incredible albums that would have sold incredibly well, I think they realized that younger music fans would start to look at them as a bit old hat, a bit tame, and so they got out while the getting was good. And that was it. Both Abbey Road and Let It Be were worldwide number ones, and now we never have to look back and say, oh, the Beatles were great, but I don't know about those last few albums. And that just makes it all the more special. That song right there, Fool in the Rain, is for me a great example of the innovation and evolution that Led Zeppelin displayed throughout their career and why they were a great band up until the very end. I mean, come on. When had we ever heard something like this from Led Zeppelin? You've got that sort of skippy rhythm, a classic example of what's known as the Purdie Shuffle, made famous by R&B funk drummer Bernard Purdie. Now, many great drummers have their own slightly different versions of the Purdie Shuffle, and Bonham's is probably my favorite. But if you want to hear the man himself performing it, just listen to Babylon Sisters from Steely Dan's Gaucho album. Let's listen to a little bit of Bonham's isolated drum track. This thing is so hypnotic, I swear I could zone out on it all day long. This is something called a halftime shuffle, and we've got a triplet feel on the hi-hat. Listen for the strong backbeat on the 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. And another great element, listen to the way he opens up the hi-hat on the second hi-hat hit. So he's doing eighth note triplets, playing generally the first and last note of each triplet. Every once in a while, he'll play a little ghost note on the middle beat of the triplet. Now, what you're going to hear in a moment is he's going to switch over to the ride cymbal, and now he's gone to quarter note triplets. So cool. And then suddenly, several minutes into the tune, everything stops, we hear a whistle blow, and the thing morphs into this weird, mad samba that goes on for a couple of minutes, like nothing we'd ever heard before. Now you wonder where that came from. Apparently John Paul Jones and Robert Plant were inspired by the music they heard while watching the 1978 FIFA World Cup tournament from Argentina. That's the thing about great artists. You never know where inspiration will come from. But it goes way beyond just Fool in the Rain. This whole album is filled with new musical adventures for these guys. You've got Southbound Soiree, Hot Dog, which is essentially rockabilly, All My Love. They had done a couple of ballads before, but nothing quite in this vein. Now, believe me, I am well aware that there are many In Through the Outdoor haters out there. I've heard from a few of you in my comments when I recently did a video on disappointing rock albums. Several of you mentioned this as a possible candidate. But in my opinion, this was a great comeback. Think of all the massive changes that had taken place in pop music in the 3 years since Zeppelin's previous album, Presence, had been released. You had the rise of disco, punk rock, new wave, radio-friendly hard rock with the likes of Foreigner. I mean, that had to have been daunting to come back and navigate all that, but I think they did it gracefully and brilliantly. The album went straight to #1 in the second week of its release in the US. It also hit #1 in the UK and other countries. It's been certified 6 times platinum. Soon after it came out, the band headlined the massive Knebworth Rock Festival in England, playing to over 200,000 people in a triumphant return. In other words, you may not like their final album personally, and that's fine, but this is clearly a band that went out on top of the music world. They were planning a massive American tour when drummer John Bonham died tragically, but not totally unexpectedly. To sum up, I think Led Zeppelin deserves a lot of credit for resisting what must have been intense pressure to reform following the death of John Bonham. Sure, there are any number of great drummers they could have recruited, but no one sounds like Bonham. It just wouldn't have been the same. Here's another way to drive the point home. Compare Zeppelin post-Bonham to The Who post-Keith Moon. For Zeppelin, obviously, they packed it in and left a more or less pristine catalog. We will always remember that band in its prime. For The Who, as much as I love them, when I think about those albums that came out after the death of Moon, it feels like it tarnishes things a little bit. Maybe that's unfair, but I can't help that feeling. I think I'm going to keep this segment short and to the point, much like the brief and chaotic career of the Sex Pistols. They released their debut album, Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, in October of 1977, and by January of 1978, on the final date of a trouble-plagued U.S. tour, singer Johnny Rotten announced the breakup of the band live on stage. There's a phrase that's entered the vernacular in modern pop culture. When something seems rebellious or controversial, people say, oh, that's so punk rock. And these guys really set the standard. Following the band's breakup, bass player Sid Vicious, who it turns out had no idea how to play the bass, OD'd on heroin after being arrested for allegedly murdering his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen. Nevermind the Bollocks contained subject matter that was really shocking for the time. You have Bodies, for example, which dealt with abortion in a profane and graphic way, Anarchy in the UK, and the single God Save the Queen refers to the British monarchy as a fascist regime and was subsequently banned throughout the United Kingdom. It was released just in time to correspond with the Queen's Silver Jubilee. I should mention that I've never really been a big fan of punk rock in general. I tend to crave melody and musicality, and punk rock is not where you go for those things. But having said that, I do understand the purpose of punk rock. Music critics have long pointed out that the rock world was becoming sort of bloated and pretentious in the mid-70s, and punk rock came along and blew all that up. Okay, I get it. Good point. Maybe rock and roll should get back to its roots and be a little bit less about virtuosity and high culture and a little bit more about raw, youthful rebellion. But at a certain point, when the so-called punk rock ethic becomes the mainstream, haven't you just become the same exact thing you were railing against? It's true that the band have reunited a handful of times over the years, mostly for one-off concerts, and there was a sort of nostalgia tour in 1996. But for the most part, I think they've done a really good job of sticking to their punk rock ethic and just letting the thing lie. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2006, and they stuck to their guns, refusing to attend the ceremony. Johnny Rotten, real name John Lydon, calling that particular institution a piss stain, a sentiment which I wholeheartedly agree with. I'm going to start with a very brief summary of this band's incredible career. 5 years, if you count from the release of the first album to the last. 5 studio albums, 6 Grammys, and 75 million records sold. In 1983, after the release of their final studio album, Synchronicity, Rolling Stone proclaimed that they were the first British new wave band to break through in America on a grand scale, and called them possibly the biggest band in the world. So what did they do? They walked away from it. Now, of course, record sales aren't everything, but when it comes to commercial success, you could not have planned a more perfect career than what these guys had. Each album literally sold better than the previous one. Most bands have a misstep in there somewhere, not the Police, and I'm rounding off the figures here. The debut album, Outlandos de Amor, 6 million. That's pretty incredible for a debut album. Regatta de Blanc, 13 million. Zenyatta Mondatta, 15 million. Ghost in the Machine, 16 million. And their final album, Synchronicity, over 20 million sold. Pretty amazing. And I would argue that they achieved all of this without ever sacrificing a shred of their artistic integrity. Like all great bands, everything they ever did was instantly recognizable as the Police. There's no way you were going to mistake Sting's voice for anyone else's. But really, Stuart Copeland's drumming and Andy Summers' guitar are also instantly recognizable. But at the same time, there was constant growth and change. The first couple of albums have an almost punk rock feel at times. By Zenyatta Mondatta, they had rounded out those rough edges. Ghost in the Machine saw the advent of keyboards. And right up to the end, Synchronicity is filled with great music. Synchronicity 1, which we heard in the intro, Synchronicity 2, Wrapped Around Your Finger, King of Pain, even Every Breath You Take, which many are quick to write off as trite pop. But there's a lot going on there. There's some great chord changes, some very interesting voicings, and a lyric that is much more nuanced than people give it credit for. It's not a happy love song, as Sting has stated many times. There's a dark side to that. I've always dug King of Pain. Sting's songs are always so musically interesting when you break them down. He has these great dissonances in his melodies. This one is an A Mixolydian thing, but it starts on the B minor chord, the 2 chord of a Mixolydian progression, whereas the melody just runs right up the A Mixolydian scale. Right? Root 2, 3, 4, 5. But notice what happens when that B chord hits. The first 2 notes of the melody are pickups. So we get, there's a li. That's right where the B chord hits. It's the 2 of the B minor. There's a li. You hear that dissonance? He does this stuff all the time. And some nice chord changes too. I love how after the first line, B minor A becomes G A. That's a nice little change. And then becomes C sharp sus4, C sharp minor, G major 7, G6. Beautiful. And as usual, he knows what he's doing with the melody. As yesterday. Okay, that E note there is the flatted 3rd of the C sharp minor, and it's the 6th of the G6th. There's a little black spot on the sun today. It's the same old thing as yesterday. There's a black cat caught in a high tree top. There's a flagpole rag and the wind won't stop. So why did they quit when they did? Well, nobody really knows except the 3 guys in the band. I do think Sting, being the songwriter, the lead vocalist, and the sex symbol and frontman of the band, probably felt like he didn't need a band, and he was right. He went on to have a hugely successful solo career. The other guys did great as well. Andy Summers went off and did some more jazz-oriented things. Stuart Copeland did some movie soundtracks. But I also wonder if the runaway success of Synchronicity gave them pause. When you get into that 20 million record sales range, that's something that you can't really control. Sometimes an album, I think, just takes off, and there's a little bit of luck and serendipity involved. Maybe they felt like that album would be so hard to follow up that they might as well just quit when they were on top. Now, they probably left some great years on the table, but then again, they managed a career that those 3 guys must be extremely proud to look back on. So that's it for now. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Just a quick reminder, financial contributions in any amount are welcome. Because of the fact that I use so much copyrighted material in my videos, pretty much all of my videos are demonetized. I make 0 from any YouTube ad revenue. So buy me a coffee, PayPal are the 2 options. Look for the links in the description of all my videos. And even a few bucks is very much appreciated if you're so inclined. See you next time.